start.
Orphan turns out. It's not as red. Yeah, it's not quite that, and it's not quite pitch kind, but kind of.
First of all, I'm very excited to see we have so many people here this evening. And it's great that we have people coming in here in the community that is interested in the history of Forsyth County. How many of you were born here?
In Forsyth?
Define here.
Yeah.
Define here.
Born here in Forsyth County.
Did you born here in Forsyth?
How many was born here in Forsyth County? All right, us three. So it's great that you people are interested that have moved here from other places over the years to find out a little bit about the history of Forsyth County. And it's really fascinating. It was a great area. I was born and raised here. My family moved to Forsyth County around the turn of the century from Suches, Georgia, up at Cooper's Creek, up above Dahlonega. Their whole life revolved around the American chestnut tree. And there was a blight, some kind of a blight, something came through and killed all the chestnut trees. And they lost their way of life. And so they moved to Forsyth County, my grandfather and his brothers. And so that's how we ended up here in Forsyth County. And I was born in 1960. By the way, my name is Rafael Picklesimer. It's a whole nother story of how I got my name. It's really something else. But my dad drove a school bus for Forsyth County for 38 years, and my family owned an auto parts store here in Cumming from 1956 until 1997. Anyway, what we're here to talk about is Chief James Vann. I believe that my friend Frank did a talk about Jacob Scudder here a few weeks ago. And that would really be a good lead-in into a series about the Cherokee Indians and the chiefs and all that lived in this area. Forsyth County was the heart of the Cherokee Nation. And the Cherokee Nation, or Cherokee Territory, it composed of a large amount of land. As a matter of fact, they carved several counties out of the Cherokee Nation. Forsyth County was one of them. There's 10 of them.
10 of them.
And
Cherokee was one.
yeah, Cherokee County was one. Forsyth County was one. I think Pickens County, Dawson. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it was really huge.
Even
Exactly.
Cobb.
Chief Vann was born probably around 1766, 1765, 1768, somewhere along in there. They don't know exactly for sure when he was born. His father was a Scottish fur trader. Now, there's been some debate as to who his father was, but I believe that his father was a guy named John Joseph Vann. Now, we know for a fact his mother was a Cherokee Indian. Her name was Wally. And when the Moravian missionaries came here, which was a Protestant group that probably formed in the 1400s, and they were an offshoot of the Catholic Church. When they broke off from the Catholic Church about 100 years before, I think about 100 years before Martin Luther. And Wally was Christianized by these missionaries. Chief Vann had met them in North Carolina and invited them to come down and build a mission church and school there where his house was built there at Spring Place. But anyway, Wally was Christianized and changed her name to Elizabeth. I believe it was Elizabeth Christiana, which I thought was right pretty. But anyway, a little bit of history about the Vanns, and we'll get on into it. Wally was was the second daughter of Gosanduiska, 1710 Virginia, died 1815 Spring Place, Cherokee Nation, which is now up there, Chatsworth. And she's in the history of the Cherokee Indians, of the old families, and she was married to this John Joseph Vann, I think was Chief Vann's father. As I researched John Joseph Vann, it was pretty interesting. I was sort of shocked, and this came from the Scottish ancestry lineage. This is from their documentation over in Scotland. And it says that John Vann was descended from Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland. And if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson, you know, the guy that played Robert the Bruce, he had to go and sort of get permission from him to anything that he did, you know. But it says John Vann was descended from Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland. He was a Scottish trader, came to Cherokee territory around 1755, and he married Wally and became a licensed trader interpreter for the Queen of England. After marrying Wally, he became chief of the Tellico in Tennessee. And his son was James, Chief Crazy James Vann. That's what they called him. And anyway, his father, John Vann, was accused of killing a Cherokee and sentenced to death. But guess how Crazy Chief James Vann's father died? He was accidentally shot by his son, Crazy James Vann. So that sort of gives you an idea of what we're going to be getting into. He was in a lot of ways he was a kind-hearted man, but his goal was money. And where some of the Indian chiefs wanted to rise up and fight against the white people, you know, when they were going to remove them and send them to Oklahoma and all that stuff, he wanted to make friends with the white men because white men equaled money. And so he played a lot of politics. And in playing his politics, everybody that came through, he'd ask them what kind of business they was in, if they had any political connections. He wanted to know everything about every white man that he come across. He was the driving force to get the old federal road through this area. And if you'll notice, if you get any of the old maps down and look, or look where the old federal road is, he just so happened to get them to go right by his properties that he owned, where he had taverns and farms and ferries down on the Chattanooga River and stuff like that. So the trade route would be right by all of his stuff. Matter of fact, here in Forsyth County, over my lifetime, we've had several county commissioners that's done the same thing. We had one county commissioner, I'll not mention any names, but I just always thought it was really funny how he was able to get the very first Forsyth County water and sewer system to go through his subdivision.
Amazing.
But anyway, so that's sort of how Chief Vann was. He was a wheeler dealer. Anyway, his stepfather was a guy named Clement Vann. In the research, now, if I come across anything that you can count on, you let me know. Clement Vann, his stepfather, after he accidentally shot and killed his real dad, I think, that's my personal opinion, that was his real dad, but I think it was, and I'll explain why in just a minute. His stepdad, Clement, was also his uncle, which was John Joseph Vann's brother. And that sort of makes sense to me because a lot of cultures would have a tradition to where if a woman was married to a man and that man died, if that man had a brother, the brother would take that widow to be his wife and carry on the family name. And I think that might be how Clement ended up being.
It's not uncommon that the white people either.
Exactly. Yeah, there's several cultures that did that. Matter of fact, I think the ancient Hebrew did that. They had that same thing as well. The brother would take on the widow as his wife and raise the children in the dead brother's name or whatever. Anyway, so we've got sort of the family tree laid out, and his father being a Scottish trader, him growing up, and then Clement was also a trader too. I think that's how he learned business, because trading involved bartering for things. And so, people would barter with their crops, they would barter with their livestock, they would barter with homemade whiskey.
Skins,
Yeah.
hides.
Yeah, hides and stuff
Furs.
like that, and him being a fur trader, that would make sense. But anyway, he was only about 43 or 44, Chief Vann was, when he was shot and killed at Buffington's Tavern. Matter of fact, I've got pictures of Buffington's Tavern where it sat before the city of Cumming bought it, moved it over here to the fairgrounds. They dismantled it, reassembled it, and moved it. How many of y'all have seen it at the fairgrounds?
I've seen it at the old site too.
Yeah. If you haven't seen it, you need to go down there. Now, it was, as you'll see here, it was originally in a log structure. And if you look at it, if you can see it through that little window they've got there, you can see the axe marks on the logs where they hand-hewed these monstrous logs to build this building. And a matter of fact, where it sat on the old Federal Road up there at the Hightower community was not its original location. They had moved it across the road. And the way they did it, they cut logs and laid them out, pushed it off its foundation on the logs, and rolled it on logs across the road to where it sat, where it was in these pictures, up until the city of Cumming moved it. So, it was amazing the fortitude and determination that people had back in the old days to do things, and how everything was worked was just so hard. But Chief Vann was probably the wealthiest, I guess he was the wealthiest Cherokee in the entire Cherokee Nation, and a lot of people said that he was the wealthiest, one of the wealthiest people in the southeastern United States. He had liquor stills, made corn whiskey. He owned a couple of gold mines in the Dahlonega here. And he owned some stamp mills and, grist mills, whatever. He had these big farms. And if you ever go up to New Echota in Chatsworth, you need to go by and see his house. There's been some research done lately that was trying to claim that his son was the one that actually built the brick house.
They're way earlier.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
1804.
His son remodeled it.
Remodeled.
I think that's what they got off track of. But anyway, get into the character.
It was considered the finest house in interior Georgia.
Yeah, and if you'll notice how it was built and how it stood all these years, I mean, it's been remodeled or whatever, but the house, as far as I can understand, has been structurally sound ever since it was built. anyway, if we want to talk a little bit about the Moravian missionaries that came here, because they kept a diary, and the diary tells a lot about what how Chief Vann acted in his everyday life. Well, like I said, if he liked you, he would help you out. I mean, he'd do things good for you. But boy, if you crossed him, you had a problem. And one of his main problems was drinking. He was an alcoholic, big time. And when he got drunk, he got mean. And I've known people that they'd be real nice, and when they were sober, they'd give you a shirt off your back if you needed it. But when they got drunk, it was just like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It was a completely different person, different personality, everything. So let me just read you a little bit of this out of the Moravian diaries. At the dawn of the 19th century, James Vann, who was visiting the Moravian missionaries, described and demonstrated conduct quite like a white man. Agreed to take them on a whirlwind tour of the Cherokee territory to seek out a suitable place for their mission. Taking note of Vann's small library, the missionaries were pleasantly surprised to find among the leaves an English volume titled New Testament, Young Man's Best Companion. One of the missionaries asked Chief Vann whether he had read some of the times, or he had read sometimes in the New Testament. They said Vann looked downward at the ground, and he said he knew he ought to, but he had always just sort of neglected it. And he told him, he said, don't be offended by what you see in me. He said that he wanted the missionaries to come and teach the Cherokee children and build a mission and a church and all at where his house was in Spring Place. Now this all sounds really good. Sounds like a man that just wants to have Christianity brought to the Cherokee Indians and you know, a school for the children to learn and everything. But look how many more people will be coming around to his tavern and his place of business and all this other stuff if they had a missionary group there with a school. See, that always played the background. Money, money, money. Getting that money. And
Part of the deal was teach religion, but you also teach the white arts, whether bricklaying, stone masonry, ironwork, everything that the white man did technically that was above the Indian at the time. He wanted them to teach that as well.
right. And he wanted the Indian to learn to get along with the white men and for business purposes. And it was funny right off the bat in the Moravian missionary diaries, and this is a direct quote. They said, namely, the missionaries wrote, he is very fond of drinking whiskey. And it talks about he was hooked. He would spend many nights drinking at his own tavern, ordering round after round, fueling his paranoid delusions, which often erupted into scenes of unimaginable violence that the brethren would never be able to forget. The missionaries tried their best to sort of keep the peace, but he had a really violent temper. He caught some people for stealing, and he tied one of his black slaves to the stake and burned him alive. And then there was a girl that had information about somebody that stole some money, like $700, and he hung her up by her thumbs until she confessed as to who did it. And then, you know, he liked to whip him. He liked to beat him, he'd shoot him. He got in a big row with his brother-in-law. I can't think of his name right now. Do you remember his brother-in-law's name? I think his last name was duel with him. And they duel, I can't remember if it's pistols or muskets. I think muskets from horseback. Was it horseback?
They ran at each other.
They ran at each other just like jousting in the medieval days in Europe, but it was two guys running at each other on horseback with muskets. And Chief Vann killed him, his own brother-in-law. And the rumor has been through family and the Blackburn family, who Thomas Blackburn, I think his name was Thomas Blackburn, that owned the tavern. I mean, he run the tavern. Chief Vann owned it. Blackburn, they call it Blackburn Tavern. It was what's there. That was
Blackburn.
Right. And so, handed down through the Blackburn family was the story that was what sealed Chief Vann's doom. In other words, when he shot and killed his own brother-in-law, that's when people decided that they needed to get rid of him. Now, some of the stories said that Chief Vann was just on horseback riding from different properties checking on things when he went to the tavern when he was killed, but actually that's not correct. Chief Vann had built a jail next to the tavern. Some of the buildings, other buildings around where the tavern set is in these pictures also. It's where you really can't tell what they were now, because over the years farmers and all had taken over, and the land where it sat had used different buildings for different things like barns, whatever. Matter of fact, Buffington's Tavern, which is now this great historical site, built in the 1700s, was once used for a corn crib and a hay barn. You know? So it's amazing, if it hadn't been built out of these monstrous logs, it probably wouldn't have survived. But anyway, he was the judge, jury, and executioner. And there was lots of thefts and stealing and things like this going on in the Cherokee Nation.
Horse stealing.
Yeah, horse stealing. And, you know, when it come to the Cherokee Indians and horse stealing, you had sort of a funny situation there, because the Cherokee Indians had a tradition that if you were walking, going somewhere, and you come across a horse, it was okay, regardless of who owned the horse or whatever, you could get on that horse and ride it to where you're going and then let it go. You know, horses will go back home. And so a lot of Cherokee Indians were accused of horse stealing simply for doing that, which they wouldn't steal in the horse, they just would borrow it to get where they was going and then turn it loose, you know.
Ride sharing.
So when people were, matter of fact, that's what happened to Chief Sony, the guy the mountain is named after. He was arrested for horse stealing, and which in actuality that's what he had done. He was walking, going somewhere, and saw a horse, got on it, rode it where he was going, and turned it loose. They got him for horse stealing anyway. Chief Sony was a carpenter. You know, he built some of the very first buildings here in downtown Cumming. But Chief Vann formed, you know, he was a member of the Cherokee Indian Chief Council. He was one of the lower ranking chiefs, but he was a member that he had got on the council. So he's big in politics in the Cherokee Nation, which also helped him with his trading and his taverns and stuff. But he had formed a group. The best way I can describe it was like the Regulators. You've heard the Old West Regulators. And they were a vigilante group, and they would go on patrol. And when he was killed, he was on horseback riding his regulator patrol. And he had come into his tavern that was over there on the old Federal Road, this one here. And he got in there and got to drinking, and they would, you know, they'd sit around and play cards, stuff like that. And his son Joseph Vann was probably 11 or 12 at the time. One of the black slaves had took him upstairs, and he went to bed and went to sleep. And the way I understood the story, and you can interject any time, Frank, on this, Chief Vann got up and went to the door. They had the door open. Of course, you know, there wasn't no air conditioning and all back then. Of course, I think he was killed in January, February, so probably cold weather, you know. But anyway,
February.
yeah. So he went to the door, and there was a guy on horseback with a hat, wearing a hat, and shot him in the doorway of the tavern and killed him. And Chief Vann's slave was afraid that they'd kill his son too, so he ran upstairs, and the staircases in these pictures were the stair. I don't know if that's the original staircase or whatever, but there's a staircase there that was in the same location with a staircase up and over that went upstairs where they had a couple of beds. He rented rooms out of it too for travelers as they come through down the Federal Road. But the slave ran upstairs, threw a blanket over his son, and carried him out, jumped on horseback, took off. And anyway, it was one of the unsolved murders in the Cherokee Nation.
There was a few suspects.
Yeah, there was a few suspects.
Can I interject this?
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
irony of it is, again, he changed many things from the tribal law and updated them. And one thing was the Cherokee blood law,
Yeah.
which he'd been involved in a time or two himself. If somebody had killed a member of your family, it fell to you, not the tribal council, not the government, not the policeman, it fell to you to get even. It was the Cherokee blood law.
Right.
And that's what happened with one of his uncles, was that they had brought in James as a murderer, and he was going to have to pay the price. And he reached over with a pistol and shot his uncle and said, "Does that square it? Because that's a family member."
Right. Yeah.
And he walked.
Yeah.
But
And see, that blood law, you know, would probably apply when
he
he
had changed
shot and
that.
killed his. Yeah, but he shot and killed his own brother-in-law in a duel. So.
He had changed the blood law, but the tribe hadn't quite caught up with him yet. So he was killed by the blood law.
Right, yeah. Now, a little bit, let me read you this about Chief Vann right here. And his date of death, you'll hear anything from February the 11th, February the 21st, whatever, but it was, and I think some of them say even in January, but I think it was in February.
It's February.
But it was,
The Moravians have it.
February of
They found out
1809.
the next morning.
Let me read you this. Brutal, violent, intemperate. These are the most common words used in regard to James Vann, and for a good reason. But James Vann made significant changes to the Cherokee world during his life, and a lasting change in his death. The son of a Scottish trader and the Cherokee wife, Vann's father Joseph and stepfather Clement were among the first white traders in the Cherokee Nation. Vann's early recognition came because he was one of the few Cherokees who could read English. As a teenager, he was called to read letters to the tribe from Tennessee Governor John Sevier and others. You've heard of Sevierville up in Tennessee where Dolly Parton's at. Anyway, when poor relations with Sevier settlers deteriorated into open warfare in the early 1790s, James Vann joined the Lower Towns Cherokee in a planned raid on Knoxville, Tennessee. During the raid on Cabot Station, the Cabot family surrendered to Bob Binge, who promised safe transport for all remaining family members. A chief named Doublehead, which James Vann had trouble out of him the rest of his life. A chief named Doublehead was not consulted for the negotiations. Angry at Binge, Doublehead and his friends attacked Cabot Station. Binge, John Watts, who was leading the raid, and Vann tried to protect the family to no avail because they had surrendered. Doublehead killed a young white boy Vann had hoisted onto his saddle to protect. then turned and tried to attack Vann. Vann avoided the blow by turning his horse. To the Cherokee Indians, the title of man killer to a warrior was a term of great respect. So from that day forward, and I always thought this was really funny, from that day forward, every time Chief Vann would get mad at Doublehead and want to belittle him, he called him baby killer because he killed that little boy. And Vann never did forgive him for that. I mean, he ragged him about that till the end. And it said Vann was instrumental in selecting a warrior whose name was Ridge, or the Ridge. The Ridge, yeah. To represent the village of Pine Log in the council. Ridge was present 3 years earlier than James Vann stood up to Doublehead at Cabot Station. Third man, Charles Hicks, lived in the town, and together the three quickly became good friends. Over the next 15 years, the Cherokee triumvirate would steer the young Cherokee nation on a path towards acculturation with the whites. That's what he was talking about. Vann was becoming a wealthy farmer, slaveholder, and respected negotiator for the Cherokees. Chief Vann owned over 100 slaves.
I know at least 50, but
I
probably.
think he did, over 100 slaves.
He had property in Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee. So how many does it take to run those properties? Yeah.
Right, yeah. And so he was spread out over a big area, and like Frank said, and Frank, I appreciate you adding that in there, he was really instrumental in bringing the Cherokee Indians into the culture, civilized culture of white people. Now, don't get me wrong, the Cherokees were very civilized on their own, you know. They wore clothes like we did. They lived in houses. You know, Jacob Scudder, we talked about Scudder's house. Scudder's house was built out of poplar logs. He lived in a log house. You know, there wasn't any teepees and run around in loincloths and stuff around here. They had their own alphabet, their own language, and they were really, really brilliant people. But anyway, so we've touched on just a few things about Chief Vann and what he had here. You know, if you go on down, follow the federal road on the old maps.
The 369.
It's Highway 369, which back in the old days was called Downing Ferry Road. Part of it was, a section of it, but the whole thing was called the old federal road. It went all the way down to, have any of y'all ever been to Van Tavern Park? Down on the lake.
It's a 3-mile bridge, I think.
Okay, Van Tavern Park on Lake Lanier was where Chief Vann's, that was actually called Vann's Tavern, used to set when it was the Chattahoochee River. It set on the river, and he also owned the ferry that ferried people across the river at his tavern. So he was a shrewd businessman, and he played politics and made sure that the federal road went by all his properties where all his stuff was at. Frank, you got anything you want to add?
Yeah, I reckon so. I think it's, to understand him a little bit better, you have to understand the dichotomy of what he was born into.
Yeah.
With the Scottish father, but to be a trader, you had to marry into the tribe. And indeed he did. So, and
you had to get a license.
yeah, and the Cherokee were matrilineal. So basically, he was his mother's son, not so much his father's son. So he was first and foremost an Indian, but he had a foot in each culture. And in the 1780s and 1790s, this is, of course, after the American Revolution, the Cherokees had fought with the British in the American Revolution. And coming out of them, they were still fighting against the white incursion. And there were, everybody thinks about the 1832 removal and everything, but there were numerous land transactions before that where 5 million acres were transferred to the white ownership and that sort of thing. And he was very much against all of that. Kentucky went in, that was Cherokee territory. That was their best hunting grounds. And some of these people like Doublehead were involved in selling that off. And one of the things that he finally got even with Doublehead.
Well,
I was
gonna tell that story. He had a lot of trouble out of Doublehead, old baby killer, and he finally got his justice on him. And what happened was, I thought this was a pretty interesting story. Doublehead, the white traders and government agents was doing a lot of business with Doublehead.
Meeks, M-I-E-G-S.
Yeah, and so, that's cutting into Chief Vann's money-making stuff, So, they sort of got to looking into what Doublehead had going on, Everybody's doing their business with him, and come find out, he's willing to take bribes and stuff on the side. Well, one of the things that he did, and I think they caught him on it in about 2 or 3 different occasions, was he was selling off some of the Cherokee land to white men.
Was this
Under
land
the
that,
table.
Under the table, which was illegal, with a penalty of death.
Whoa.
So, it says, Vann learned that on 3 occasions Doublehead out illegally sold Cherokee land to whites, which was a crime punishable by death. At first, few people would listen to Vann as he exposed Doublehead's activities, but slowly he convinced a majority of the nation that Doublehead was indeed committing crimes. And James Vann, the Ridge, the guy named the Ridge, and Alexander Saunders were selected to kill Doublehead for his betrayal, possibly with the approval of the tribal council. It says at the appointed time that they were supposed to kill Doublehead, Vann was too drunk to commit the murder. It was the first in a series of botched attempts that eventually ended in Doublehead's death at the hand of Vann's friend, the Ridge, is the one who finally killed him. So, there you go. He's constantly drinking and everything else, and you would think that he would really savor this revenge on Doublehead. But then when it got time to do it, and he got permission by the tribal council to kill him, then he's too drunk to do it. So, anyway, what's your question?
I was going to tell you that Vann's philosophy of having more with the Cherokee and preserving the ethnic group. 10 years ago, they had ethnic cleansing in Cherokee, North Carolina, and they made all the non-whites European, they call it European blood, get out, sell off to them. And their wives had to be at least half Cherokee, or the spouse, one or the other, like you were talking about. Yeah. And my best friend told me that because I used to buy daylilies from her, and she was on the council. They kicked her off because her husband, he was Australian, and he was considered, no, you can't do that. But you're a full member of the tribe, and any benefits that may come from the government, you're entitled to. But you can't serve on the council anymore. They kicked her off. And that's still going on today. And if you go to that museum in Cherokee, you will hear that owner and some of his cohorts, they do not speak English. They speak Cherokee. And it is very, you talk about a language hard to get a hold of. I'm good with languages, but I can't figure that one out to save my life.
Yeah, well, that's the way it was with so many of the different Native American languages. In World War II, the Navajos were famous as the tongue talkers.
Yeah.
And that was one code that the Japanese, whatever, they could not break it. And I'm glad that they were finally honored all those years later, which was an honor they deserved. But the Cherokee language and their symbols and all that stuff was really fascinating. And I thought it was so sad that And this is one of the things that was done, and I mean, you know, you'd be ashamed of it, but it happened. Nothing I can do about it. But a lot of the Native Americans, including the Cherokees, their own culture was sort of banned and outlawed. You know, they were put in school, they were forbidden to speak or write or whatever their own language. They were taught English, and you know, it was sort of a forced assimilation. And nowadays we have no assimilation at all. You know,
That's the trouble.
Yeah.
just you know, whatever. A lot of people don't know this, but immigration in the United States was completely stopped in I think the 1920s, and was not restarted until about 1965 or 66. And guess who wrote up the bill and pushed and got it passed to restart immigration in the United States in the mid-1960s? Ted Kennedy.
Okay.
Yeah. And the reason they stopped it completely, now there was a little bit of immigration between 1927 and 1965 or 66, whenever it was, but it was under very special circumstances. But they gave the immigrants that came here the time to assimilate to the American culture, the American way of life, and to be Americans. I mean, my family name was Gurkenheimer. My family came from Germany. Matter of fact, we still have relatives that lives in Munich, Germany. Gurkenheimer. Immigrants in those days wanted to be Americans, and they would Americanize their names. Well, you go to the grocery store, go down to Publix, go down the pickle aisle, and you'll see Gherkin pickles. Well, gherkin is the German word for pickle. So, my family name of Gurkenheimer from Munich, Germany, the Americanization of the name became Picklesimer. People wanted to be Americans, you know. And so you had that time of assimilation. But a forced assimilation that destroyed a culture with the Native Americans, you know, that was just wrong. My beautiful wife is sitting there behind that camera. Her name is Eliza Modolo Picklesimer. She was born and raised in Venice, Italy. And she came to the United States in 2007. She is currently she's the smart one of the two of us. She has 2 master's degrees and a PhD. And she is the lecturing professor of Italian language and culture at Coastal Carolina University in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Conway. So, needless to say, I spent a lot of time at Myrtle Beach. But I still have family here in Cumming, and I come back and visit, whatever. But I know we sort of got off track a little bit. But anybody got any questions about Chief Vann? And hopefully me or Frank will know the answer. Go ahead.
So was Doublehead, I believe his name is, was he selling Cherokee land that belonged to him, or was he selling just everyone else's?
What was that again there?
Doublehead, I believe his name was? Was that
Yes.
his name? Was he selling like Cherokee land that did belong to him, or was part of his domination, or
Tribal.
It was
Tribal?
tribal, yeah. None of the Cherokees actually owned the land. It was all Cherokee tribal land. But you could have parts of it for your own, you know, house and stuff like that. But it was all basically tribal land. In other words, if something happened, if you were a Cherokee Indian,
yeah.
you had a house and like Chief Vann had a house, the tavern, and all that stuff. If you had no descendants and you died off or whatever, it would automatically revert back to the Cherokee tribe as tribal land. So, and he was actually selling.
It would be inherited by his mother's family.
Right. Yeah. The
And
maternal side was one where it would
that's
inherit.
another dust up, was because when he wrote his will, which is about a year before he died, he sent it all to his son,
His son
which was against Cherokee law.
right.
And so the tribal council actually took that into consideration, and he got the bulk of it. but they also distributed part of it to the others. To
Yeah,
the-
on his family side, and that's how they did it. But the son, Joe, which after he inherited all that stuff, guess what his nickname was? Rich Joe Vann.
Oh my gosh.
That's what they called him. Rich Joe Vann. And he had steamboats and stuff on the Ohio River and Mississippi River.
That's how he died.
And everywhere, yeah, matter of fact. And he had a streak of his daddy in him. He was pretty wild. He liked to play cards and drink that whiskey and all. And they was on, was they on the Ohio River?
I don't know which river it was.
They was on the river, just a second, in Kentucky. And they noticed a steamboat that was ahead of them and going faster. So Rich Joe said, we're going to catch it. We're going to have us a steamboat race. So, boy, they started stoking the fire in that boiler. I mean, they was pouring, the old saying, pouring the coals to it. Well, they still wasn't catching up. So I think they were gaining a little bit, but they were still behind. And they had some animal fat. I don't know if it's fatback, grease, or something. Big thing of animal fat. You know, they carry stuff like that when there's provisions. Civil War soldiers carried fatback and whatever, you know. Anyway, they threw. Now this is crazy. If you know anything about how these steam boilers work, you know, we have a steam engine parade on 4th of July. If you've ever seen that, the fire boxes, they stoke that fire and, you know, the steam and make it go. But they threw that animal fatback in to the burner box of the boiler on this ferry boat, and dangerous. Now the story was that one of the slaves, I think it's one of Rich Joe's slaves, he ordered him to throw the fatback or the animal fat, whatever you're gonna call it, into the firebox. So he did what he was told. He threw it in and then jumped overboard. Anyway, he jumps overboard, swim for it, and the boiler blew up and killed everybody on that steamboat.
Except for that one that jumped into the river.
They found Rich Joe Vann's arm
Oh my gosh.
in a tree.
Oh wow.
And they took his arm. Now this is as the story goes. But they took his arm and sent it back to the family at Spring Place for them to have a memorial or ceremony or something. But that's,
So you know what the final is on that story?
what was it?
He was Rich Joe Vann, but when he died, he didn't even have an arm and a leg.
But anyway, so in that story there again, you can see how the family sort of.
Now his early life, he was involved with a lot of raids on settlers and that type of thing.
Yeah.
But they were usually return affairs because, and John Sevier was one of the ones who led groups. They would go in and wipe out 50 villages. And he said, okay, well, we'll wipe out this, you know, and that thing. And so he grew up very much in a firestorm. And his own, his father and then his Uncle Clement's stores were both wiped out a couple of times. So he carried with him a certain resentment and pretty well raw dislike of white people.
Yeah, I've got a picture right here.
What year did Joe die?
Joe died in about 1844. 1843,
So,
1844.
After the removal, so.
Oh yeah.
But he wasn't
yeah.
in the area
Yeah,
anyway.
Rich Joe was born about 1798.
He'd be 10 years old at the time of the death, so that'd be, you know.
Well, that'd be about right. And he died in like 1843 or 44. But
And
the
they
river
could
they
stay
was on, I'm thinking it was the Ohio River. I don't know for sure, but I know for a fact it was in Kentucky where that happened. Yeah,
On getting back to Doublehead, and I'm not gonna try to
Yeah,
take
go
over
ahead,
the
go ahead.
conversation. Doublehead was just like, Chief Vann. He controlled the Tennessee River from Muscle Shoals to Watts Bar, and that was his territory. And he had people just like Chief Vann. And they got a big resort up there now near Muscle Shoals that's named Doublehead Resort. And you can go up there and they got everything up there. But he controlled a lot of the river traffic right there. But he said, he was cutting into Chief Vann commerce on the river especially. That's all he could say.
He was Lower Cherokee, wasn't he?
yeah.
And Vann was Upper Cherokee. And the two didn't mix real well. And towards the end of James' life, they did resolve into being Cherokee rather than the separation.
But now, didn't Chief?
But that was one of the problems, is that the Lower Cherokee would raid the white settlers, and so John Sevier or whoever would come in and wipe out the Upper Cherokee. So, thanks for the help there, buddies.
Yeah, really.
At one time, they kidnapped some of the Crockett family
Yeah,
and held them for a couple of years. It's amazing the names that circulated around James Vann when he was young.
but his,
The doublehead you're talking about, is that the same as Doublehead Gap up there in Cherokee National Forest?
No,
Doublehead Gap Road and all that?
where's it at?
Lower Chattahoochee National Forest, like south of Suchess area.
Probably so.
Yeah, there's a Doublehead Gap.
Yeah, because like I said, the Cherokee Nation was huge, and they cut 10 counties
That's just out of the Georgia section.
just out of the Georgia section.
It's
Yeah,
1832.
Yeah,
Lumpkin County, North Lumpkin County area.
yeah. Well, Lumpkin County was one of the counties cut
That's
out of the
one of them.
Cherokee Nation also.
Okay.
So yeah,
well, you said Chattahoochee?
Yeah,
Okay. Chattanooga was part of Doublehead's route right there.
that makes sense. There's
And then you got
old
Chattahoochee,
roads up
I'm
there.
sorry, I didn't
Yeah.
mean to say no.
Okay,
That's true.
yeah.
I've got a picture of what the Forsyth County Historical Society finally located Chief Vann's grave. The actual location of it had been lost for years and years. All the accounts was when he was shot at the tavern, he was buried not far from the tavern, in a grave that put a little picket fence around it.
That same night.
Yeah, he was
Did it
buried
in dark.
that night, yeah. And so, yeah, that's right, they buried him in the middle of the night. And through some techniques or whatever, I think one of the way they found his grave was
Metal detect.
they found a line of nails that was marked out where they had the nails that held the little fence together that they had put around his grave. And so they put a marker up. The Forsyth County Historical Society did. I'm just going to turn this around and let you look at it here, because I think you can see it on this computer screen pretty well.
There was a diary written, I don't know, 1820s, of a traveler that came through and described the terrain leading up to the gravesite, and then described the gravesite, and he said there was a picket fence around it.
Yeah.
And so that's what they went with. The other thing, of course, being a Cherokee, he was buried, would it be east to west? So they had to find He was probably the first one buried there as well.
You can tell me where I get the angle where you can see it. That's what the Forsyth County Historical Society put once they located it.
And where
Now-
is the place?
The actual grave site is over there on the old Federal Road
It's Blackburn Cemetery,
at, Blackburn Cemetery.
and it had been Blackburn's Tavern.
Oh,
Yeah, Thomas Blackburn, it was Blackburn's Tavern, but Van owned it.
And it's
Mr. Blackburn just ran it for it.
Yeah, it was James Vann's
Yeah.
tavern.
Yeah, Chief Vann owned it.
And Ernest Sherrill was the last one to own the farm, which is kind of across the street. The Sherrill Farm.
Right. Now, I'm
And he
gonna
was
do
the
this
one-
old school because I trust all of y'all. But these are the pictures I personally took of Buffington Tavern, which is Chief Vann's tavern that he owned. This is where he was shot and killed. You can look them, pass them down to the next person, and all of the buildings that was around it at the time I took these pictures. And this is the building that the city of Cumming bought and is now down here at the fairgrounds. It don't look like this because they put siding over, they put wood siding over the logs. But they left a window type thing open to where you can see the original logs and you can see the axe marks where they, I mean, I looked at that and I was just amazed at how much work went in to make those logs and do that, just build that one building. But just, you flip through those and then just pass it around to the others. And as y'all are looking at that, if y'all got any other questions or comments or anything?
Is that the pictures there, is that the one that some of the presidents
Yeah,
of the United States
yeah,
stayed in?
James Monroe in about 1819. Like I said, the old Federal Road was the main thoroughfare through here, going to Macon or going to,
No, well, no, up to,
went up to Tennessee.
At Tellico, it
Yeah.
went to Nashville and Murfreesboro,
Yeah,
and it started in Augusta.
yeah, and then south it went, like I said, all the way to Augusta, whatever. But anyway, that was the main thoroughfare through, and so James Monroe was traveling, and when he was president in 1819, and spent the night in that building, in that tavern upstairs. You know, you think about how our presidents travel now, and this entourage, and you know, millions of dollars spent on a week trip to Europe or something.
Yeah, they stayed in that building, and the funny thing of it is, first off, it was the first recorded incidence of a president, a sitting president, spending the night outside of the United States. Because he was in the Cherokee Nation, he was not in the United States.
Yeah, so it was
And-
like he was a,
Secondly, everybody downstairs was all ticked off at him, because here's two fine-looking gentlemen getting off a stage, and they've got all these suitcases. Well, nobody has suitcases unless you're a drummer, which means a traveling salesman.
right.
So they're saying, when are they gonna open up their suitcases? We may wanna buy some of this. What, are we not good enough for them? So they were getting just really mad under the collar because it was secret who they were. And this might be a wives' tale, but the next morning, Louis